The first time my son tried to take my home away from me, he smiled while he did it. There were 12 people sitting around my dining table that evening. My son Brian kept calling it a family meeting. His wife Jennifer placed several papers in front of me and said softly, "Mom, this is for your own good." Everyone watched me. Everyone expected me to do what I had done for years, stay quiet. But inside my purse was a sealed envelope my late husband had told me never to open unless my own family turned against me. As Brian pushed the pen toward my hand, I finally looked him in the eye and said, "Not this time. If you've ever stayed silent just to keep your family together, I'd love to hear your story. Please like and subscribe if this journey speaks to your heart. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and whether you think some family secrets should remain buried or finally be spoken aloud." After my husband died, the house became too quiet. People often tell widows that time heals everything. But I discovered that time simply teaches you how to carry pain without letting others see it. 3 years had passed since Thomas Simmons was buried beneath a maple tree in Greenlawn Cemetery outside Columbus, Ohio. And every morning, I still reached for the other side of the bed before remembering that it had been empty for a very long time. The house we had shared for 38 years sat at the end of a peaceful street lined with old oak trees. Thomas had built most of it himself. He used to joke that every wall contained his fingerprints and every floorboard remembered his footsteps. After he died, I couldn't bring myself to change much. His favorite chair still sat beside the fireplace. His coffee mug remained inside the kitchen cabinet exactly where he had left it. The silence inside those rooms became my companion. I was 62 years old, retired from teaching second grade, after more than 3 decades, and learning how to live alone for the first time since I was 23. My daughter Emily called nearly every evening from Cincinnati. "Mom, have you eaten dinner?" "Yes." "Did you take your medication?" "Yes." "Are you feeling okay?" I always answered the same way. "I'm fine, sweetheart." The truth was more complicated. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't helpless. But I was lonely in a way that frightened me. Brian, my oldest child, lived only 20 minutes away. He and his wife Jennifer visited regularly during the first few months after Thomas died. They brought casseroles, offered help with errands, and insisted they wanted to make life easier for me. At first, I appreciated it. Grief makes you grateful for any kindness. But slowly, very slowly, something began to change. Brian started handling things without asking me. He paid bills before I could look at them. He answered questions from the insurance company. He called contractors when repairs were needed. Whenever I tried to make decisions myself, he would smile and say, "Mom, let me take care of it." Jennifer often stood beside him. "You've been through enough. You shouldn't worry about these things. It's too much stress at your age." At first, those words sounded caring. Later, they felt different. One afternoon, I mentioned that I wanted to repaint the dining room. Brian shook his head. "That would be expensive." I blinked. "It's my dining room. I'm just saying you should save your money." Another time, I wanted to replace the old washing machine. Jennifer laughed softly. "Do you really need a new one? You live alone." I began noticing how often they answered questions that had been directed at me. How frequently they spoke about my future, as though I weren't sitting in the room. How often the phrase, "for your own good," appeared in every conversation. Emily noticed it too. During Thanksgiving, she pulled me aside while everyone else watched football. "Mom, is Brian controlling your finances?" I immediately defended him. "No, he's helping." She studied my face. "Are you sure?" "Of course," but even then I wasn't completely certain. The truth is that I had spent most of my life avoiding conflict. Thomas used to tell me that I cared too much about keeping peace. "If people know, "You'll always sacrifice your happiness," he once said. "They'll begin expecting it." I never forgot those words. Yet I continued doing exactly that. When Brian interrupted me, I stayed quiet. When Jennifer dismissed my opinions, I smiled. When decisions were made without me, I accepted them, because I told myself it was easier, because I didn't want my children fighting, because I had already lost my husband and couldn't bear losing my family too. Every Sunday afternoon, I walked through the house dusting furniture that nobody used anymore. The upstairs bedrooms remained exactly as they had years earlier. Emily's old posters, Brian's baseball trophies, boxes filled with school projects and forgotten memories. Sometimes I sat on the edge of Brian's childhood bed and wondered when my little boy had become someone I barely recognized. Mason, my 15-year-old grandson, still visited occasionally. Unlike the adults, he behaved naturally. He talked about school. He complained about homework. He raided my refrigerator. One afternoon, he found me gardening. "Grandma, why do Dad and Mom always ask about your house?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "They talk about it a lot." My hands froze. "What exactly do they say?" "I don't know." He kicked at the dirt. "They just say it would solve everything." Before I could ask more questions, his phone rang and the conversation ended. But his words remained with me. It would solve everything. What exactly needed solving? That evening, Brian called. "Mom, Jennifer, and I think you should consider downsizing." I stared through the kitchen window. "Why? The house is too large." "I like my house." "You don't need all this space." "I've lived here almost 40 years. There was silence. Then he said gently, "We're only thinking about your future." After we hung up, I sat alone at the dining room table. Outside, snow had begun falling across the backyard. The same backyard where Thomas had taught both children to ride bicycles. The same backyard where birthday parties, graduation celebrations, and summer barbecues had filled the air with laughter. How could someone simply decide those memories no longer mattered? I eventually climbed the stairs to my bedroom. Inside my closet sat an old cedar chest. Most people would have overlooked it. The wood had faded. The brass lock had tarnished. Inside were photographs, letters, insurance papers, and documents Thomas had carefully organized before his death. At the very bottom rested a small locked box. I had not opened it in 3 years. Thomas placed it there during his final week in hospice. His voice had been weak. "Promise me something." I squeezed his hand. "Anything." "If the day comes when you feel alone in your own family, open this." I had promised him, but I wasn't ready. Not then. Maybe not ever. I touched the lid. My fingers rested against the cold metal. Part of me wanted answers. Another part feared them. Downstairs, the telephone rang. It was Jennifer. "We're thinking about having your birthday dinner at our house this year. My birthday is still weeks away. We just want to make it special." Her voice sounded cheerful, too cheerful. After we ended the call, I stood alone in my bedroom. The locked box sat quietly before me. For the first time since Thomas died, I began to wonder if my husband had seen something that I refused to see. And for the first time, I was no longer certain that my silence was protecting my family. Maybe it was protecting everyone except me. I still remember the exact sound of the rain hitting the windows the night Thomas asked me to make him a promise. It was late October, 3 years before the family meeting that would eventually change everything. The hospice bed had been placed in our living room because Thomas wanted to spend his final days looking out at the backyard he had planted with his own hands. The maple trees had already turned red, and fallen leaves covered the grass like a blanket. Cancer had taken nearly everything from him except his eyes. His eyes remained clear until the very end. That evening, the nurse had left after checking his medication. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. I sat beside him holding his hand. His fingers had become thin and fragile, nothing like the strong hands that had built our home, repaired our cars, and carried our children when they were small. "Elise," he said softly. I leaned closer. "I'm here." He took a slow breath. "I need you to listen carefully." At first, I thought he wanted to discuss funeral arrangements again. We had already spoken about them many times because Thomas believed in preparing for everything. Instead, he looked toward the hallway. "Is Brian here?" "No, he left an hour ago." He nodded slightly. "And Emily? She's staying at the hotel." Only then did he continue. "There are things I should have told you sooner." I immediately felt afraid. Thomas had never been a dramatic man. He believed in facts, not emotions. If he said something was important, it truly was. "What things?" His eyes closed for several seconds. "When a man knows he's dying, he notices things differently." I squeezed his hand. "You don't have to talk if you're tired." "No, I do." His voice had become weaker. "I've been worried about Brian." At first, I smiled. "He's just stressed." Thomas looked directly at me. "No, it's more than stress." I had heard those words before. Over the previous year, Thomas had mentioned concerns about our son several times. Brian had changed jobs twice. He seemed frustrated, impatient, constantly chasing new business opportunities, but I had always defended him. "He's trying to provide for his family." Thomas remained silent. Eventually he said, "Have you noticed how often he talks about money?" I didn't answer, because I had noticed. At family dinners, Brian often discussed investments. He talked about real estate. He complained about expenses. He worried about his future. Sometimes he spoke about success as though it were something desperately running away from him. But he was our son. And parents always find explanations. "He'll figure things out." Thomas sighed. "I hope so." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The rain continued outside. Then Thomas said something that would stay with me for years. "Your kindness is beautiful, Elise." I smiled. "Thank you. But it's also dangerous." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You always believe people deserve another chance." "Most people do." He shook his head. "No. Some people simply learn that you'll keep forgiving them." I felt tears gathering. "We're talking about our son." "I know." His eyes became wet. "And that's what makes this so difficult." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. But something inside me remained quiet. Because I had noticed Brian becoming impatient. I had seen him interrupt his father. I had watched him dismiss certain concerns. I had heard him ask questions about finances while his father was still receiving chemotherapy. At the time, I told myself he was simply preparing. Thomas reached toward the small table beside his bed. There sat a large manila envelope. He placed his hand on it. "If the day comes when you feel alone in your own family, open this." I frowned. "What is it?" "You'll know when it's time." "Thomas, promise me." His voice became firm for the first time in days. "Promise me you won't let guilt make decisions for you." I felt my throat tighten. Why are you saying this? Because you've spent your entire life taking care of everyone else. He paused. And someday, somebody may ask you to sacrifice yourself again. I began crying. He reached up weakly and touched my cheek. You don't have to save everyone. Those words frightened me because I knew exactly what he meant. Throughout our marriage, I had been the peacemaker. When Brian and Emily argued, I solved it. When relatives disagreed, I apologized. When people disappointed me, I excused them. Thomas often joked that I carried everyone's pain except my own. That night, however, he wasn't joking. Will you promise me? I nodded. I promise. He closed his eyes. Several tears rolled down my face. I don't want to lose you. His smile was small. You won't. You just said, I'll still be here. His eyes opened again. Especially when you need me. 3 weeks later, Thomas died peacefully in his sleep. The funeral brought hundreds of people. Former employees, neighbors, church friends, former students of mine. Brian stood beside me greeting visitors and helping with arrangements. He appeared strong, responsible, caring. Everyone praised him. You raised a wonderful son. I believed it too. At least I wanted to. Months passed, then years. The envelope remained untouched inside the locked box. Sometimes I considered opening it, especially during lonely nights, especially after difficult conversations with Brian. But every time, I stopped myself. Because opening it felt like admitting Thomas had been right. And if Thomas had been right, then what did that mean about our son one Sunday afternoon, about 2 years after the funeral Emily visited? We sat on the back porch drinking coffee. She suddenly asked, Did Dad ever talk to you about Brian? The question startled me. Why? She hesitated. Sometimes I think he was worried. I carefully placed my cup down. What makes you say that? Emily looked toward the yard. Dad called me a few months before he died. I felt my heart beat faster. He did, she nodded. He asked me to look after you. Everybody says that. No, she turned toward me. He specifically said not to let anyone pressure you. I couldn't speak. She continued quietly. He never explained. I looked away because I suddenly remembered the envelope, the promise, the warning. Yet even then, I said nothing. Perhaps because mothers spend years protecting their children, even grown children, even children who may no longer need protection or deserve it. That night after Emily returned to Cincinnati, I climbed upstairs. I opened the closet. I pulled out the cedar chest. Inside rested the locked box. My fingers touched the brass key attached underneath. I held it for several seconds. Then I put it back. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Because opening that box meant accepting that my husband had spent his final days worried about our family, and I desperately wanted to believe he had been wrong. But as I stood there in the quiet bedroom we once shared, I heard his voice again. Your kindness is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. And for the first time in 3 years, I began to wonder if my silence had become exactly the thing Thomas feared. The first time Brian asked me to sell my house, he said it as if he were discussing the weather. It was early March, nearly 3.5 years after Thomas had passed away. Winter still clung stubbornly to Ohio, and patches of snow remained along the sidewalks outside my home. Brian stopped by one Saturday morning, carrying coffee and pastries. At first, everything felt normal. He asked about my health. He complained about work. He talked about Mason's grades. For almost an hour, we sat at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had spent thousands of mornings together. Then Brian placed his coffee cup down. "Mom, have you ever thought about selling the house?" The question surprised me. "Why would I sell it?" He shrugged. "It's a lot of work. I manage. The property taxes keep increasing. I can afford them." He smiled patiently, almost as if he were explaining something to a child. "You don't need all this space anymore." I looked around the kitchen, the yellow curtains, the old wooden cabinets, the clock Thomas bought during our 10th anniversary. This wasn't simply a house, it was my life. "I like my space." Brian nodded. "I'm just saying, you should think about the future." The future. People often use that word when they want something from you. After he left, I tried not to think about the conversation. But 2 days later, Jennifer called. "Brian mentioned he talked to you." "About the house?" "Yes." I folded laundry while speaking. "I told him I wasn't interested." She laughed softly. "Oh, you don't have to decide immediately." "There isn't a decision to make. We just worry about you." There it was again. That sentence. We worry about you. I thanked her politely and ended the call. That evening, Emily phoned. I mentioned the conversation. She became quiet. "Mom, Brian brought it up to me too." My heart sank. "He did. He asked what I thought about you downsizing." "What did you tell him?" Emily didn't hesitate. "I told him it wasn't my decision." I sat down at the kitchen table. "Maybe he's only concerned." "Maybe." But her voice suggested otherwise. A week later, Brian returned. This time, Jennifer came with him. She carried a folder. I noticed it immediately. We sat in the living room. Rain tapped against the windows. Jennifer opened the folder. We found several wonderful retirement communities. I stared at her. "Retirement communities? They're beautiful." Brian nodded. "They have activities, medical staff, transportation." I felt confused. "I'm not moving into a retirement community." Jennifer smiled. "Nobody is forcing you." Yet everything about the conversation felt exactly like pressure. Brian leaned forward. "The house is worth quite a bit now." I looked at him. "How much?" "Almost 400,000. I blinked. "When did you have it appraised?" Neither of them answered immediately. Jennifer finally said, "We were just curious." I felt a cold sensation in my chest. "You had my house appraised." Brian looked irritated. "Mom, we're trying to help." "Without asking me," he sighed. "Why are you upset?" Because suddenly, I felt as though decisions about my life had been happening somewhere else. In rooms where I wasn't invited. At tables where my opinion no longer mattered. "I don't want to sell." Brian rubbed his forehead. "You aren't listening." "No, Brian, you're the one who isn't listening." Silence filled the room. Jennifer stood. "We should go." After they left, I walked through the house. For the first time, I saw it through their eyes. Old, large, valuable, a piece of property. But I also saw the growth chart inside the pantry where I had measured my children every birthday. I saw the dining room where Thomas proposed to me during Christmas. I saw the fireplace where Emily announced her nursing school acceptance. How could those things have a price? Several days later, I visited Thomas's grave. The cemetery was quiet. I brought fresh flowers. As I stood there, I spoke aloud. "They want me to sell." The wind moved through the trees. I don't know what to do. I felt foolish talking to a gravestone. Yet somehow it comforted me. On the drive home, I stopped at a grocery store. As I walked toward my car, I heard someone call my name. Mrs. Simmons. I turned. It was Linda Parker, one of my former students. She was nearly 40 now. I heard Brian talking about your move. I frowned. My move? She looked surprised. He said you were selling your house. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He said that. She nodded. He mentioned it at the bank. I drove home in silence. Brian had already begun telling people, as if the decision had been made, as if I had agreed. That evening, I called him. You told people I'm moving. He sounded confused. Who told you that? Linda Parker. He sighed. I only said you were considering it. I am not considering it. Mom? No. There was silence. Then his voice changed. It became colder. You're being stubborn. The word hurt, because mothers hear it differently, not as criticism, as rejection. I'm protecting my home. You're making things harder. For whom? He didn't answer. Instead, he said, You'll understand eventually. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark living room. For the first time, I felt afraid. Not because I believed Brian would hurt me, but because I no longer understood him. The following Sunday, Emily drove from Cincinnati. She found me unusually quiet. What happened? I told her everything. She listened carefully. When I finished, she asked a question I didn't want to answer. Do you trust Brian? I immediately responded. He's my son. That's not what I asked. I looked down. The silence between us lasted several seconds. Finally, I said, I don't know. Emily reached for my hand. Mom, something isn't right. Tears filled my eyes. I don't want this family to fall apart. She squeezed my fingers. Maybe it already is. That evening, after Emily returned home, I noticed an envelope sticking out from beneath several magazines on the kitchen counter. I didn't recognize it. Inside was a real estate brochure. On the back, someone had written numbers, estimated sale price, closing costs, possible profit, and at the bottom, split between family. My hands began shaking. I didn't know whether Brian had left it accidentally or intentionally, but suddenly I understood something that terrified me. They weren't discussing my future. They were discussing my assets. For the first time since Thomas died, I climbed the stairs and opened the closet. I removed the cedar chest. I unlocked the small box. Inside sat the manila envelope Thomas had left. My fingers touched it. But before opening it, I heard my husband's voice again. If the day comes when you feel alone in your own family. I sat quietly on the bedroom floor. Because for the first time, I truly did. My 63rd birthday arrived on a warm Saturday in May. For the first time in years, Brian insisted on organizing everything himself. Mom, you deserve a special day, he told me over the phone. Jennifer quickly added, no cooking, no cleaning, just enjoy yourself. On the surface, it sounded thoughtful. Emily even admitted that perhaps Brian was trying to repair the tension that had grown between us during the previous months. Part of me wanted to believe that. Another part remembered the real estate brochure, the house appraisal, the conversations that seemed to happen without me. Still, I agreed to attend. The dinner would be held at Brian and Jennifer's home. By the time I arrived, several relatives had already gathered. My sister-in-law, Carol, was there. Brian's cousin, Michael. 2 neighbors who had known our family for years. Even Mason had put on a collared shirt, which immediately told me his mother had insisted. The dining room looked beautiful. Candles, flowers, a large chocolate cake. Photographs from different stages of my life. For a few moments, I allowed myself to relax. Perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps grief had made me suspicious. Jennifer hugged me tightly. "Happy birthday, Elise." Brian kissed my cheek. "We love you, Mom." Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they somehow made me uneasy. Everyone seemed unusually attentive. My glass never became empty. People constantly asked if I needed anything. Brian pulled out my chair. Jennifer brought extra dessert. At one point, Carol whispered, "You're being treated like a queen tonight." I smiled, but deep inside, I felt something I could not explain, almost as if everyone had memorized their roles. Dinner passed pleasantly enough. We talked about Mason's school, Emily's hospital, vacation plans, rising prices, the weather. Then, after dessert, Brian stood. He picked up his glass. "I'd like to say something." The room became quiet. He looked directly at me. "Mom has always sacrificed everything for this family." Everyone nodded. "She spent her entire life taking care of us." More nodding. "And now it's our turn to take care of her." A strange feeling settled inside my chest. Jennifer walked toward a cabinet. She returned carrying a leather folder. My heart immediately sank. Brian smiled. "Mom, we've been discussing some options that could make your future easier." Emily stiffened beside me. "What options?" Brian ignored her. "We found a beautiful condominium community only 10 minutes from us." Jennifer opened the folder. "They have security maintenance social activities," I interrupted. "I thought this was my birthday dinner." The room became uncomfortable. Brian forced a smile. "It is." "Then why are we discussing my house?" Jennifer spoke gently. "We thought everyone could help." Emily put her fork down. "Help with what?" Brian sighed. "Emily, please don't start." "Start what?" "The drama?" I could feel every eye in the room moving between my children. My hands rested quietly in my lap. For years, I had avoided scenes exactly like this. Jennifer slid several papers toward me. "We only want you to look at them." I didn't touch them. One page showed photographs of condominiums. Another listed estimated costs. Then I noticed something else. A calculation. Sale price of my house. Projected profit. I looked up slowly. "Why is this here?" Brian rubbed his forehead. "Mom!" "No. Why is this here?" He spoke carefully. "If you sold the house, you'd have money to enjoy retirement." Emily stared at him. "She already has money." Brian looked irritated. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Carol suddenly stood. "I'll get coffee." Nobody stopped her. The atmosphere had changed completely. Jennifer leaned toward me. "We're only thinking long term." I looked at her. "My husband built that house." "I understand." "No, you don't." Brian's voice became firmer. "Mom, you're being emotional." The words cut deeper than he realized, because women my age hear those words our entire lives. Too emotional, too sensitive, too attached, too difficult. I remained quiet. Mason, who had been silent throughout dinner, suddenly spoke. "Dad said we might move into Grandma's house." The room froze. Brian turned toward his son. "Mason." The boy looked confused. "What?" Jennifer immediately said, "That's not what we said." "Yes, you did." Brian's face became red. "Mason, enough." The teenager looked down at his plate. Nobody spoke. My heart pounded loudly enough that I could hear it. Emily finally broke the silence. "You told him that Brian became defensive. We discussed possibilities. You discussed moving into Mom's house? You're twisting my words. No, your son just explained them. I sat quietly while the people I loved argued around me. Suddenly, I felt very old. Not because of my age, because I realized I had become the subject of a conversation rather than a participant. As if my life belonged to everyone except me. Jennifer tried to regain control. Elise, we only want what's best. I looked directly at her. Did I ask you to decide what's best? She looked surprised. Brian answered for her. We're your family. Exactly. My voice shook slightly. So why does nobody ask what I want? Nobody answered, because nobody had. For several moments, the only sound came from the air conditioner. Then Brian spoke quietly. We worry about you living alone. I looked at him. And I worry about why you're so interested in my house. His expression changed. Hurt. Anger. Perhaps both. You think I'm trying to take your house? I didn't answer. Because I honestly didn't know. But the question itself seemed to answer something. Emily stood. Mom, let's go. I looked around the room. Relatives avoided eye contact. Jennifer stared at the table. Brian looked exhausted, and Mason appeared frightened. This was supposed to be my birthday. Instead, it felt like an intervention. As we gathered our things, Mason suddenly walked over. He hugged me. Very quietly, he whispered something. Grandma, they talked about this for weeks. My body went cold. I looked at him. What? His eyes widened. I wasn't supposed to say. Brian called his name. Mason! The boy stepped away. Emily and I left shortly afterward. The drive home was silent. Streetlights passed through the windshield. Finally, Emily spoke. They planned that. I nodded. I know. They invited people intentionally. I know. She gripped the steering wheel. They wanted pressure. Tears filled my eyes, not because of the house, not even because of Brian, but because my birthday had become a business meeting. When I entered my home, the silence felt overwhelming. The old clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed. Everything looked exactly as Thomas had left it. I walked upstairs, opened the closet, pulled out the cedar chest. This time, I opened the small locked box completely. The manila envelope remained exactly where Thomas had placed it. For several seconds, I held it in my hands. Downstairs, my telephone rang. It was Brian. I let it ring. Then it rang again and again. I sat on the bedroom floor holding my husband's final instructions while my son's name continued flashing across the screen. For the first time in my life, I realized something that terrified me. The people I had spent years trying to keep together had already made plans without me. And somehow, without noticing it, I had become the last person invited into my own future. I did not sleep that night. After returning from my birthday dinner, I sat in my bedroom holding Thomas's envelope while the house remained completely silent around me. Brian had called several times. Jennifer had left 2 voicemail messages. Emily had texted to make sure I was all right. I answered none of them. For years, I had been the person who immediately returned every call, solved every disagreement, and apologized for problems I did not create. That night, I simply sat. The envelope rested in my lap. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Thomas's handwriting appeared on the front. For Elise, only when you truly need this. My hands trembled. Part of me wanted answers. Another part was afraid that opening it would change my relationship with my son forever. Around midnight, I finally returned the envelope to the box. Not because I wasn't curious, because I felt I still needed one thing first: the truth. The next morning, I called someone I had not spoken to in nearly 2 years: Richard Bennett, Thomas's attorney. Richard had been more than our lawyer. He had been Thomas's closest friend since college. The two men had built businesses together, attended football games together, and helped each other through difficult years. When his receptionist answered, I almost hung up. Instead, I said quietly, "This is Elise Simmons." A few seconds later, Richard came on the line. "Elise?" "Hello, Richard." His voice softened. "It's been a long time." "Yes." There was a brief silence. Then he asked, "Is everything all right?" I looked around my empty kitchen. "No." He did not ask questions. Instead, he said, "Can you come by my office tomorrow?" "Yes." "And Elise?" "Yes." "Bring the envelope." My heart skipped. "You know about it." "I know, Thomas." That night, I hardly slept. The following morning, I drove downtown to Richard's office. His building had not changed. Dark wood walls, framed legal degrees, the same grandfather clock in the waiting room. Richard himself looked older. His hair had become completely gray, and his glasses seemed thicker than before. But his eyes remained kind. He hugged me gently. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "So am I." He led me into his office. For several minutes, we talked about Thomas, about retirement, about Emily, about life. Finally, Richard folded his hands. "Tell me everything." And for the first time, I did. I described the pressure, the discussions about selling the house, the birthday dinner, the real estate documents, the comments from Mason. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he remained silent. "Did Thomas talk to you before he died?" I asked. Richard nodded. "He did." My heart began beating faster. "What did he say?" "He was worried." "About Brian?" "Yes." The answer hurt, even though I had expected it. I stared at the floor. Richard spoke carefully. "Thomas loved your son." "I know. But he also saw changes." "What changes?" Richard leaned back. "Financial problems." I looked up. "Brian." "He came to see me several years ago." I felt cold. "Why?" "He wanted information." "What kind of information?" "About Thomas's estate." My hands tightened. But Thomas was still alive. "Yes." The room suddenly felt smaller. Richard continued. "I refused to discuss it." "When was this?" "About 8 months before Thomas passed away." I struggled to process what I was hearing. Brian had been asking questions about inheritance while his father was fighting cancer. "No." Richard looked at me gently. "I wish I were wrong." I swallowed. "Did Thomas know?" "Eventually." Tears began filling my eyes. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Richard answered quietly. "Thomas wanted to protect you." I laughed softly. "He always did." Richard opened a drawer. He removed a thick file. My husband's name appeared on the front. Thomas Simmons Estate Planning. "There are things you need to understand." He opened the file carefully. Several documents lay inside. Trust agreements, property records, financial statements, and something else. A trust fund. I stared at the pages. "What is this?" "Thomas created a family trust." I looked at him. I didn't know. "He wanted it that way." "How much?" Richard hesitated. Enough that your future is secure. I sat silently. For years, I had believed that our savings consisted mainly of insurance money, retirement accounts, and the house. Apparently, Thomas had planned much further ahead. He left instructions. What instructions? Richard removed another sealed document. He specifically instructed me not to discuss this unless you came to me voluntarily. I whispered, he knew. Richard nodded. He feared someone might pressure you. The tears finally came, because suddenly Thomas was sitting beside me again. His warnings, his concerns, his voice. Your kindness is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. Richard handed me a tissue. He loved you very much. I know. He worried that after he died, you would put everyone else's needs before your own. I laughed through tears. That sounds like me. It does. We sat quietly. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding. Has Brian contacted you? Richard's expression changed. Yes. When? Several times. I could barely breathe. About the trust. About your finances. When? The most recent call was about 6 months ago. My chest tightened. What did he ask? Richard answered carefully. He wanted to know whether you had any restrictions on selling the property. I closed my eyes. Everything suddenly began connecting. The appraisal, the pressure, the conversations, the birthday dinner. Richard leaned forward. Elise, I want to be clear about something. I looked at him. Your husband trusted you. I don't feel very strong. Strength isn't the absence of fear. He pointed toward the file. Everything Thomas built was intended to protect you. My eyes moved toward the envelope sitting in my purse. I still haven't opened it. Richard smiled slightly. Thomas always was dramatic. I actually laughed. He really was. Richard became serious. When you're ready, open it. I nodded. As our meeting ended, he handed me copies of several documents. One page especially caught my attention. Primary Decision Authority. Beside it appeared my name, Elise Simmons. Not Brian, not anyone else. Only me. As I walked back to my car, the sunlight felt strangely warm. For the first time in months, I did not feel helpless. I felt frightened, heartbroken, confused, but not helpless. When I arrived home, I found a message on my answering machine. Brian. Mom, we need to talk. Another message followed. Jennifer. We're worried about you. Then another. Please call us. I sat quietly in my kitchen. Richard's words echoed in my mind. Your husband trusted you. For years, I had believed my silence kept the family together. But perhaps my silence had only allowed everyone else to make decisions for me. That evening, I climbed the stairs. I opened the cedar chest. I removed the envelope. This time, I did not put it back. Instead, I placed it on my bedside table, because something inside me had finally changed. For the first time since Thomas died, I no longer wanted everyone else to tell me the truth. I was ready to find it myself. The first time I truly believed my son was hiding something, I found his bank statement by accident. At least, that is what I told myself. Perhaps nothing in families is ever truly accidental. 3 days had passed since my meeting with Richard Bennett. During those days, Brian called repeatedly. Jennifer sent text messages asking if I was angry. Mason even left a short voicemail asking if Grandma was feeling better. I answered none of them. For years, I had responded immediately whenever my family needed me. But something had changed inside me after sitting in Richard's office and hearing that Brian had approached him about my finances while Thomas was still alive. I could not forget it. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Brian arrived unexpectedly. I heard his truck pull into the driveway. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home. Instead, I opened the door. He stood there, holding grocery bags. "I brought dinner." His voice sounded tired. I stepped aside. He entered quietly. For several minutes, we unpacked groceries without speaking. Finally, he said, "Mom, why are you avoiding me?" I placed soup cans into the cabinet. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About many things." He sighed. "If this is about your birthday." "It is." "And it isn't." He looked confused. "What does that mean?" I turned toward him. "It means your father's death, the house, the pressure, the conversations." Brian rubbed his eyes. "Mom, we're trying to help." I had heard those words so many times that they no longer meant anything. "Do you need money?" The question escaped before I could stop it. He stared at me. "What do you... Why would you ask that?" I watched his face carefully. Because mothers know their children differently than anyone else. I saw fear. Only for a second. But I saw it. "Brian." He forced a laugh. "No." "Are you sure?" His expression hardened. "What did Emily tell you?" "This isn't about Emily." "Then who?" I remained silent, because I would not involve Richard. Brian stood. "Mom, this is becoming ridiculous." "Is it?" "Yes." He picked up his jacket. "I came here because I was worried." And I asked one question. He left shortly afterward. The conversation unsettled me, not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. That evening, Emily called. "How did it go?" "He denied everything. Did you expect anything else?" I looked out the window. "No." Emily hesitated. "Mom, can I ask something?" "Of course." "Have you checked public records?" I frowned. "What records?" "Court records, liens, lawsuits." The idea shocked me. Brian wouldn't. "Mom." I stopped talking, because 3 months earlier I would have said Brian would never pressure me to sell my house, and yet he had. The following day, I returned to Richard's office. He welcomed me immediately. "You look troubled." "I need to ask something." "Of course." "Can financial information become public?" He studied me. "What specifically?" "Debt." Richard was quiet. Finally, he stood and walked toward a computer. "Elise, I normally avoid discussing private matters." "I understand." "But if your financial security may be affected, that's different." Several minutes passed. His expression changed. "What is it?" He removed his glasses. "Brian has significant debt." The room became silent. "How much?" Richard hesitated. "More than $200,000. I felt physically ill. "No." "There were business investments." "What investments?" "Commercial property." "Did they fail?" "Apparently." I sat motionless. My son. My little boy who used to catch fireflies in the backyard. My son who cried during his first day of school. My son who held my hand during Thomas's funeral. $200,000. Richard spoke carefully. "There are also loans." I swallowed. "What kind?" "Personal loans. Business loans." "And Jennifer?" "I don't know." Tears filled my eyes, not because of the money, because Brian had carried this burden alone, or perhaps because he had hidden it. "Does Thomas's trust know about this?" Richard shook his head. No. Could creditors reach my house? No. Relief washed through me. Then Richard said something else. There is another issue. I looked up. What? He slid several papers across his desk. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I saw my own name, my signature. Except it wasn't mine. I stared. What is this? A preliminary document? My hands began shaking. What kind of document? It appears to authorize discussions regarding property sale. I looked closely. The signature looked similar, but not identical. This isn't mine. Richard nodded. I know. I could barely breathe. When was this filed? About 4 months ago. I felt cold. Who submitted it? He hesitated. I don't have complete information, but I already understood. I didn't want to understand, yet I did. No. Richard spoke softly. Elise, no. Because mothers can forgive many things. Lies, mistakes, failures. But seeing your own name written by someone else's hand is different. It feels like theft, not of money, of trust. I drove home in complete silence. Every memory suddenly changed. Every conversation, every request, every discussion about my future. When I entered my house, I found Mason sitting on the front porch. He stood immediately. Grandma, what are you doing here? He looked nervous. Dad and Mom were fighting. About what? I don't know. He lowered his voice. But Dad said, if this doesn't work, we're going to lose everything. My heart stopped. Everything. The word echoed inside me. I sat beside him. Mason, has your father been worried? The boy nodded. He doesn't sleep. My anger softened slightly, because beneath the deception was fear. Beneath the pressure was desperation. Beneath the lies was my son, broken, ashamed, lost. But that did not excuse what he had done. Mason looked at me carefully. Are you mad at Dad? I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said, I'm sad. The boy nodded. I think he is too. After he left, I climbed the stairs. The envelope still rested beside my bed. I sat down. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. For the first time, I realized Thomas had been trying to protect me not only from greed, but from guilt, because I could already hear my own thoughts. Help him. Save him. Give him the house. Make everything better. That had always been my role. The peacemaker. The rescuer. The mother. But another voice had finally begun speaking. A quieter voice. A stronger voice. What about you, Elise? I looked at the envelope. My fingers touched the seal. This time, I knew I would open it soon. Because my son's secret debts had finally revealed something even more painful. The family I had spent years protecting had been falling apart long before I ever realized it. Emily arrived on a Friday afternoon carrying an overnight bag, 2 grocery sacks, and the determined expression she had inherited from her father. The moment I opened the front door, she hugged me tightly. You're losing weight. I smiled. That's your nurse voice. And you're avoiding my question. For the first time in weeks, I actually laughed. Emily had always been different from Brian. As children, Brian rushed toward every opportunity, while Emily quietly observed everything around her. He wanted to lead, She wanted to understand. Thomas often said that Brian had his ambition, while Emily had his patience. As she unpacked groceries in my kitchen, I watched her moving around the room exactly as she had when she was 16. The same careful movements, the same thoughtful expressions, the same habit of placing flowers in a glass whenever she found them. "How long are you staying?" I asked. "The weekend." She looked at me. "And maybe longer if necessary." I knew exactly what she meant. That evening, we sat on the back porch with coffee while the sun disappeared behind the trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emily asked, "Did you open Dad's envelope?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She nodded. "I understand." I looked at her carefully. "Did Dad ever talk to you specifically about Brian?" Emily stared into her coffee. "Once." My heart tightened. "What did he say?" She took a long breath. "He asked me to promise something." "What?" "That I wouldn't leave you alone." The evening suddenly felt colder. "He really said that?" She nodded. "It was a few months before he died." I looked down at my hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Dad asked me not to, unless you needed to know." Tears filled my eyes. Thomas had been preparing, perhaps longer than I realized. Emily reached for my hand. "He loved all of us." "I know. But I think he worried that you would always put everyone else's needs first." I smiled sadly. "Your father knew me too well." Emily laughed softly. "He certainly did." Later that night after dinner, we brought the cedar chest into the living room. The old box sat between us. For several moments, neither of us touched it. Finally, Emily asked, "Do you want me here if you open it?" I looked at the envelope. "I don't know." She nodded. "We don't have to do it tonight." Part of me wanted to. Another part still resisted, because opening it meant crossing a line. It meant accepting that Thomas had seen something in our family that I had refused to see. So instead, we opened the other files Richard had given me. Trust documents, financial statements, property records. Emily read quietly. After several minutes, she looked up. "Mom?" "What? Did you know about any of this?" I shook my head. "No." "Dad protected you." "Apparently." She turned another page, then another. Suddenly, she stopped. "What is this?" She handed me a document. It appeared older than the others. The paper had yellowed slightly. At the top was Thomas's signature, and below it, amendment to the Simmons family trust. I frowned. "I've never seen this." Emily carefully read several paragraphs. Her eyes widened. "What?" She looked at me. "This was updated 6 months before Dad died." My pulse quickened. "What does it say?" She read quietly. "In the event of pressure coercion or attempts to influence Elise Simmons regarding family assets, all final authority remains exclusively with her." I felt my throat tighten. Thomas had anticipated everything. Emily continued reading. "He specifically states that no family member may act on your behalf regarding property or trust decisions." I sat silently. Every conversation with Brian suddenly felt different. Every request, every suggestion. Emily looked up. "Dad knew." I whispered, "Yes." For the next hour, we organized papers across the dining room table, the same table where Brian had tried to persuade me to sell the house. As we sorted documents, Emily suddenly became quiet. "What?" She held up another folder. "This wasn't with Richard's papers." I frowned. The folder looked familiar. I opened it. Inside were copies of several documents, and among them was something that made my stomach drop. The same signature. My signature. The false one. Only this version was incomplete. It appeared to be a draft. Emily stared. "This isn't yours." "No!" She looked angry. "Mom, this is serious." "I know." She continued examining the pages. Then she froze. "What?" "There are initials." I leaned closer. Tiny handwritten letters appeared in the corner. B.S. Brian Simmons. My chest felt hollow. I wanted another explanation. Any explanation. But none came. The room became painfully quiet. Emily spoke first. "Maybe he didn't do it himself." I nodded. Maybe. But neither of us believed it. After midnight, we finally stopped. Emily made tea. We sat in the kitchen exactly as I had once sat there with Thomas. She looked exhausted. "So, what happens now?" I didn't know. For 62 years, my answer to conflict had always been the same. Avoid it, forgive it, endure it. But now, something else existed. Evidence. Questions. The truth. The next morning, Mason unexpectedly appeared. He stood on the porch looking nervous. Emily answered the door. "Hey." He shifted awkwardly. "Is Grandma here?" I came forward. "What's wrong?" He looked over his shoulder before entering. "My parents are fighting again." Emily and I exchanged glances. "What about—" "I don't know." He sat at the kitchen table. "But Dad keeps saying everything is falling apart." The boy looked frightened. I sat beside him. "Mason, none of this is your fault." He nodded. Then he quietly said something that made the room completely still. "I heard Mom say Grandpa changed the will." Emily looked at me. "When?" "Last month." "What exactly did she say?" He tried to remember. "She said Grandpa made sure Dad couldn't touch something." I felt my heart begin pounding. After Mason left, Emily immediately returned to the documents. "What if there are more papers?" I looked toward the cedar chest. The envelope remained inside, still sealed, still waiting. For the first time, I realized something. Perhaps the envelope was not simply a letter. Perhaps it contained answers. Emily looked at me. "Mom," I nodded slowly. "I think your father wanted us to find all of this first." "Why?" "So I would finally be ready to believe him." The house became quiet again. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. Inside, the dining room table remained covered with documents. Trust papers, financial records, the false signature, and one unopened envelope. For years, I had believed I was alone. But sitting beside my daughter, I finally understood something important. I was not alone. I had simply spent too many years standing beside the wrong people. And for the first time since Thomas died, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt prepared. Because whatever truth waited inside my husband's final message, I would not face it by myself. The family meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon. Brian called me himself. His voice sounded tired. "Mom, we need to settle this." I stood in the kitchen holding the phone while sunlight spilled across the old wooden floor. "Settle what?" "Everything." There was a long silence. Finally, he added, "The whole family will be there." The whole family. The words immediately brought back my birthday dinner. The smiles, the documents, the pressure. I looked toward the dining room where Emily was sorting papers. I'll think about it. Mom, please. His voice cracked slightly. We can't keep doing this. After we ended the call, Emily looked up. What did he want? A family meeting. She immediately frowned. When? Sunday. Why, he said we need to settle everything. Emily folded her arms. No. I looked at her. No. He's doing it again. What do you mean? He wants witnesses. The truth of her words settled heavily inside me. Brian had always disliked private confrontations. Even as a child, he preferred allies. If he was punished, he wanted someone else to agree it was unfair. If he argued, he wanted support. Perhaps this meeting wasn't for me. Perhaps it was for him. That evening I called Richard. You don't have to go, he said. I think I do. Why? Because I was tired. Tired of whispers. Tired of assumptions. Tired of wondering. I need to hear him. Richard was quiet. Then don't go alone. I won't. Sunday arrived gray and cool. Emily drove with me. Neither of us spoke very much. Inside my purse rested the envelope, still sealed. Beside it sat copies of the trust documents and the papers Richard had given me. For the first time in my life, I was carrying evidence against my own son. The thought nearly broke my heart. Brian's house was already full when we arrived. Cars lined the street. Inside, several relatives sat in the living room. My sister-in-law, Carol, Brian's cousin, Michael, Jennifer's brother, Daniel, 2 family friends. Even Mason ate quietly in a corner. The atmosphere felt strange. Nobody seemed comfortable. Jennifer greeted us. Thank you for coming, Emily answered before I could. We didn't have much choice. Brian appeared from the dining room. His eyes looked tired. For a brief moment, I saw my little boy again. Then the expression disappeared. Mom? Brian! He nodded toward the table. Can we sit? The dining room had been arranged almost like a business meeting. Papers, pens, water glasses, several empty chairs. I suddenly understood why Emily had refused to come alone. Because this was not a conversation. It was an audience. Everyone sat. Nobody spoke. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. My stomach tightened. He continued. We've become divided as a family. Jennifer nodded. Nobody wants that. Brian looked directly at me. Mom, we're worried. Again. That word, worried. I remained silent. He continued speaking. The house is becoming difficult for you. No. His eyebrows rose. No, it isn't difficult. He sighed. Mom, please. I mow the lawn. I pay my bills. I drive. I cook. I live alone. I looked around the room. What exactly am I unable to do? No one answered. Jennifer finally spoke. We're talking about the future. I asked quietly, whose future? The room became still. Brian rubbed his forehead. Mom, why are you making this harder? Because for 62 years, I had made everything easier. For everyone else. Emily suddenly spoke. Why is everyone here? Brian looked irritated. They care. No. She pointed toward the papers. Why are these here? My eyes moved toward the center of the table. Documents. Again. Always documents. Jennifer picked them up. We just wanted Mom to review options. With witnesses? Emily asked. Carol shifted uncomfortably. Michael looked down. Nobody wanted to be involved. Yet everyone was already involved. Brian's voice grew firmer. "Mom, we need to discuss your ability to manage the property." The sentence hit me harder than anything else he had said. My ability. I looked directly at him. "Do you believe I cannot manage my own life?" His expression softened. "No." "Then why are we here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, Jennifer spoke. "Elise, please understand." "No." My voice surprised even me. For years I had interrupted myself before anyone else could. This time, I continued. "No, Jennifer. You understand." The room became completely silent. I looked around. Every face, every relative, every person who had spent years assuming I would simply smile. I buried my husband. My voice trembled. I learned how to live alone. I paid my bills. I survived grief. I looked at Brian. And somehow all of you decided I couldn't decide where I live. Brian looked stunned. "Mom." "No." Tears filled my eyes. "But this time, you listen." Emily reached over and squeezed my hand. For the first time in years, I did not stop myself. "I have spent my entire life protecting this family." I looked directly at Brian. "I protected you when you failed classes. I protected you when you lost jobs. I protected you when you argued with your father." My voice softened. "And I protected you even after he died." Brian looked down. I continued. "But nobody protected me." Jennifer opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was nothing to say. Mason sat quietly watching everything. I suddenly realized something. He was learning what families do, learning who speaks, learning who stays silent. I did not want him learning silence from me. Brian finally spoke. "Mom, that's not fair." I looked at him. "What isn't fair?" "You're making us sound selfish," Emily answered. "Because you've been acting selfish." "Stay out of this." "No." Brian stood. "So now everyone thinks I'm some villain?" Nobody answered, because the truth had begun entering the room. And truth is often quiet. Brian looked around desperately. "I was trying to help." I asked the question that had haunted me for months. "Help me." My eyes met his. "Or help yourself." His face changed, just slightly. But enough. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Nobody moved, and then for the first time, Brian looked genuinely frightened, because perhaps he finally understood something. I was no longer the woman who would apologize to keep peace. I was no longer the widow who quietly accepted decisions. Inside my purse rested my husband's envelope. Beside it sat documents, evidence, answers. And for the first time in years, my family realized something they had never expected. I had come to the meeting prepared to speak, but they still had no idea how much I knew. No one moved. After my question hung in the air, "Help me or help yourself," the entire room seemed to stop breathing. Brian stood beside the dining table, his hands resting against the back of a chair. Jennifer sat perfectly still. Emily remained beside me, her fingers gently wrapped around my hand. For years, I had imagined what confrontation might feel like. I expected anger. I expected shouting. Instead, there was only silence. And silence, I learned, can sometimes be far more frightening. Brian finally spoke. "You think I'd steal from you?" His voice cracked. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The dark circles beneath his eyes, the gray beginning to appear near his temples, the exhaustion. For a brief moment, I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after baseball practice. But then I remembered the false signature, the debt, the pressure, the meetings, the plans. I don't know what to think anymore. Jennifer suddenly stood. "This has gone too far." Emily immediately answered. "No, it hasn't gone far enough." Brian looked at me. "Mom, tell her." "Tell her what?" "That we're family." The words hurt, because family had always been my weakness. Every time someone said, "We're family," I immediately became willing to sacrifice myself. But not today. I quietly asked, "Brian, are you in trouble?" His face changed, only slightly, but enough. Jennifer answered before he could. "Everyone has financial stress." I looked directly at her. "That isn't what I asked." Brian rubbed his forehead. "I'm handling it." "Handling what?" He didn't answer. The room grew uncomfortable again. Carol looked down. Michael shifted in his chair. Even Mason seemed frightened. And then Jennifer said the one thing that finally broke something inside me. "Elise, at your age, you need people making rational decisions." My heart stopped. At your age, not because of my age itself, because of what she meant. You are old. You are emotional. You are incapable. You no longer decide. I slowly turned toward her. "My age," she immediately realized what she had said. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Brian intervened. "Mom, please." "No." I stood. My knees trembled. My heart pounded. But I stood. For years, everyone in that room had only known one version of me. The quiet version. The apologetic version. The woman who smiled to avoid conflict. I looked at Jennifer. "I buried my husband alone." I looked at Brian. "I learned to sleep alone." I looked around the room. I managed my finances. I paid my bills. I survived grief. My voice shook. But somehow, all of you decided I became incapable. Nobody answered, because there was no answer. Brian finally walked toward me. "Mom." He reached for my hand. I stepped back. The pain on his face nearly destroyed me, because no matter what happens, mothers still love their children, even when they disappoint us, even when they break our hearts. His voice became softer. "I'm scared." The room fell silent again. Emily looked at him. "Of what?" Brian closed his eyes. He didn't answer. Jennifer spoke instead. "We've had some financial problems." There it was. The truth. Or at least part of it. Emily folded her arms. "How serious?" Brian looked down. "I can fix it." "How serious?" He still didn't answer. I quietly asked, $200,000. His head immediately lifted. The entire room froze. Brian stared at me. "Who told you?" I didn't answer. His face turned pale. Jennifer looked terrified. Emily slowly sat back down. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Brian whispered, "You know." I nodded. The tears began filling his eyes. Not mine, his. And somehow that was even more painful. "Mom, I never wanted you to find out." I asked quietly, "Then what exactly did you want?" He looked around the room, at his son, at his wife, at his family. I thought if we sold the house. He couldn't finish. Jennifer began crying. We were drowning. I listened, because finally, after months of pressure and lies, I was hearing honesty. Brian sat down heavily. I invested in a commercial project. Emily asked quietly, without telling anyone. He nodded. It failed. How much did you lose? He swallowed. Everything. The room remained silent. Brian looked at me. I thought I could fix it. By selling my home, I was going to take care of you. I shook my head. No. He looked confused. No. You were going to save yourself. The words hurt both of us, because they were true. Jennifer wiped her eyes. We didn't know what else to do. Emily spoke coldly. So you forged Mom's signature? Brian looked up immediately. What? The documents. His face turned white. What documents? I opened my purse, slowly, carefully. Inside sat the copies Richard had given me, the false signature, the initials, the evidence. I placed them on the table. Brian stared. Jennifer stared. Everyone stared. He picked up the papers. His hands shook. I didn't. Then he stopped, because lying had become impossible. I asked quietly, Did you sign my name? Tears rolled down his face. I was desperate. The room became absolutely still. Carol covered her mouth. Michael looked away. Mason began crying softly. And suddenly, I realized something. This was the moment Thomas had feared, the moment he had prepared for, the moment he had left the envelope. Brian looked at me. Mom, please. His voice sounded like a child. I never wanted to hurt you. I believed him. That was the terrible part. I believed he loved me. I also believed he had betrayed me. Both things were true. Emily reached into my purse. She removed the sealed envelope. The room immediately became quiet again. Brian frowned. What is that? I looked at the familiar handwriting. Thomas's handwriting. For Elise. Only when you truly need this. My fingers touched the seal. For 3 years I had protected that envelope. Because opening it meant accepting that my husband had seen this day coming. Now that day had arrived. Brian whispered, Mom. I looked at him. For the first time in my life, my son looked afraid of losing me. Not financially, personally, emotionally. Perhaps completely. My hands trembled. Everyone watched. Jennifer, Emily, Mason, the entire family. Outside, thunder rolled across the Ohio sky. Inside, the only sound came from my breathing. Very carefully, I broke the seal. The paper unfolded slowly. Thomas's handwriting appeared across the page. My husband. Gone for 3 years, and yet suddenly closer than ever. I looked down at the first sentence, my vision blurred with tears, because the very first words Thomas had written were, My dearest Elise, if you are reading this, it means the day I feared has finally arrived. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that my late husband had known far more than any of us ever imagined. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. For several seconds, I could not continue reading. The familiar handwriting blurred through my tears. Thomas had always written in careful, steady lines, every word deliberate, every sentence considered. The room remained completely silent. Brian sat motionless. Jennifer held a tissue against her mouth. Emily stood beside me. Even Mason seemed afraid to breathe. I wiped my eyes and read aloud. My dearest Elise, if you are reading this, it means the day I feared has finally arrived. It means someone you love has asked you to doubt yourself. It means you have once again tried to carry everyone else's pain while forgetting your own. My voice broke, because even after 3 years, Thomas somehow still knew me better than anyone alive. I continued, if Brian is part of the reason you opened this letter, please understand that I write these words with love, not anger. Brian lowered his head. I could see tears falling onto his hands. Thomas wrote, Our son is not a bad man, but he is a frightened man. Fear makes people do dangerous things. Pride makes them hide their failures, and shame can convince them that hurting the people they love is the only way to survive. The room became very still. Jennifer quietly began crying because Thomas had somehow described exactly what had happened. I took a slow breath. If Brian has failed financially, do not sacrifice yourself to save him. If he has lied, do not lie with him. If he asks you to surrender your home, your security, or your dignity, do not do it. My voice shook. Love him. Pray for him. Forgive him if you choose, but do not disappear for him. I stopped reading because I could no longer see the words. Emily gently touched my shoulder. Mom, I nodded and continued. You have spent your entire life keeping peace, but peace that requires your silence is not peace at all. It is surrender. Brian covered his face. The room filled with quiet sobs. Thomas's words felt less like a letter and more like his voice returning to us. Then I reached the section that changed everything. I have created a trust and legal protections that place every final decision in your hands, Elise. No one else may sell the house. No one else may control our assets. No one else may act on your behalf. I looked up. Brian stared at me. The entire room understood. Thomas had never intended his son to control the family estate. He had trusted only me. I continued reading. If our children stand beside you, embrace them. If they turn against you, stand anyway. You are stronger than you believe. My tears returned. Because Thomas had always seen strength in me that I never saw myself. The next lines nearly broke my heart. Please tell Brian that I loved him until my final breath. Tell him that mistakes are survivable. Debt is survivable. Failure is survivable. But dishonesty destroys families. Brian began openly crying. I had not seen my son cry since his father's funeral. His shoulders shook. His hands trembled. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who once climbed into our bed after nightmares. The letter continued. If he has fallen, let him stand up himself. Rescue him emotionally if you wish. But do not rescue him financially by destroying your own future. I lowered the paper. No one spoke. The only sound came from the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. Finally, Brian whispered, He knew. I nodded. Yes. He knew about me. I think he worried. Brian stared at the floor. He never said anything. Emily answered quietly. Maybe he hoped you would find your own way. Jennifer suddenly spoke. We didn't mean for this to happen. Her voice was barely audible. I know. She looked at me. We were scared. I studied her face. For months, I had seen her only as the woman pushing me to sell my house. Now I saw something else. Fear, exhaustion, desperation. But fear does not excuse betrayal. Brian finally lifted his head. Mom, I forged the signature. The room froze. Although we already knew, hearing the words felt different, more real, more painful. I kept telling myself it was temporary. His voice cracked. I thought if I could fix everything, nobody would ever know. I quietly asked, how long? Almost 2 years. Emily stared. You've been hiding this for 2 years. He nodded. Jennifer spoke softly. We lost almost everything. Brian continued. I borrowed money. From who? I asked. Banks. Investors. How much? He swallowed. Nearly 300,000. The room became silent again. Even Emily seemed shocked. Brian looked directly at me. I never wanted your money. I answered honestly. I believe you. His eyes filled with confusion. You do? Yes. I took a deep breath. But I think you wanted my house. He lowered his eyes, because both things were true. He loved me, and he had been willing to sacrifice me. That realization hurt more than the debt. Richard's words suddenly came back to me. Fear makes people dangerous. Thomas had written almost the same thing. My husband had understood our son long before any of us. Emily finally spoke. What happens now? Nobody answered, because this was not only about money anymore. It was about trust. Brian looked at me. What are you going to do? The question carried years of history, because my answer had always been predictable. Forgive, protect, save. But I was no longer certain. I looked down at the final paragraph. My voice became quiet. If you are reading this, Elise, then remember one final thing. Speaking the truth is not betrayal. Protecting yourself is not selfish. And saying no to someone you love does not mean you love them less. I folded the letter. For several moments, nobody moved. Then I looked directly at my son. I love you. Fresh tears rolled down his face. But I cannot save you this way. He closed his eyes. Perhaps he had already known. Perhaps he had feared hearing it. Jennifer began crying again. Emily remained beside me. Mason quietly wiped his eyes. And for the first time in years, I understood something. Thomas had not left me the letter to expose Brian. He left it to save me, because he knew exactly what would happen. I would sacrifice myself. I would surrender my future. I would call it love. And somehow, even after death, my husband had reached across 3 years of silence to tell me something I desperately needed to hear. My life still belonged to me. No one left the dining room. Even after Thomas's letter had been folded and placed back inside the envelope, nobody moved from their chairs. The afternoon sunlight had disappeared, and shadows slowly filled the room. For years, my family had lived inside half-truths. Now, the truth sat openly on the table between us. Brian wiped his eyes. Jennifer stared at the floor. Emily remained beside me. Mason sat quietly in the corner, looking far older than 15. I looked at my son. "How long have you been planning to sell my house?" Brian swallowed. "I don't know." "Tell me the truth." He rubbed both hands across his face. "About a year." Emily immediately reacted. "A year?" He nodded. "It started after the business failed." Jennifer quietly added, "The investors wanted their money." "What investors?" Emily asked. Brian looked exhausted. "There were 3 partners. And they lost money. Everyone lost money." The room became quiet again. I asked softly, "Why didn't you come to me?" Brian looked directly at me. "Because you would have worried." I almost laughed. "Brian, I have been worrying for months." He lowered his eyes. "I thought I could fix it." "By yourself?" "Yes." "And when you couldn't," his voice broke. "I became desperate." Jennifer finally spoke. "We argued constantly." Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "We couldn't sleep." She looked at me. "We weren't trying to hurt you." I answered honestly. "But you did." Nobody argued, because nobody could. Emily reached into her purse. She carefully removed several copies of the documents Richard had given us. The false signature, the authorization forms, the property paperwork. She placed them on the table. Brian stared at them. His face became pale. Jennifer looked shocked. "I've never seen these." Brian didn't answer. Emily spoke quietly. "Did you sign Mom's name?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Brian's shoulders sank. "Yes." Mason looked at his father. "Dad." Brian covered his face. "I never submitted the final paperwork." Emily answered coldly. "But you signed her name?" "I know." "That's forgery." "I know." Every answer sounded smaller than the last. I sat quietly, because strangely, my anger had changed. Months earlier, I had imagined screaming, demanding answers, perhaps even leaving. Instead, I felt heartbreak, because the man sitting across from me was both my son and a stranger. Jennifer looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" He stared at her. "You already knew." "No." "You knew I was trying." She shook her head. "Not this." Their marriage suddenly appeared different. Not partners, not conspirators. 2 frightened people sinking together. Emily turned toward me. "Mom, Richard should see all of this." Brian immediately looked up. "No." I met his eyes. "Why not?" His voice trembled. "Because if this becomes legal," I interrupted. "It already is." Those words seemed to hit him harder than anything else. For the first time, he realized the consequences extended beyond family arguments. There were documents, signatures, records, facts. Carol finally spoke. "I think everyone should calm down." Emily looked at her. "This isn't about being calm." Michael quietly added, "Maybe Brian needs help." Brian laughed bitterly. "I need more than help." Nobody disagreed. Several minutes passed. Then Mason suddenly stood. Everyone looked at him. His voice shook. "I hate this." My heart broke. He looked at his father. "You lied." Brian closed his eyes. "Mason." "You told me Grandma would be happier." No one spoke. "You said everybody agreed." Brian began crying again. "I was wrong." Mason looked at me. "Grandma, are you going to leave?" I stood and walked toward him. "No." He immediately hugged me. His body trembled, because children understand loss differently. To him, losing the house meant losing memories. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer afternoons. His grandfather. I held him tightly. "No one is taking me anywhere." He nodded against my shoulder. For the first time that day, I felt certain. The house would stay, not because of money, because it still belonged to my life. When Mason sat down, Emily quietly spoke. "I think everyone should know something." She looked at the room. "Dad created the trust specifically to protect Mom." Several relatives appeared surprised. Emily continued. "He expected pressure." Carol looked shocked. "Thomas expected this," I answered softly. "He worried." Brian's eyes filled again. "He didn't trust me." I looked at my son. No, the word hurt both of us. "But he loved you." Brian nodded slowly. "I know." "And maybe he understood you better than anyone." Jennifer wiped her eyes. "So, what happens now?" Nobody answered immediately, because the truth had finally been exposed. Now, consequences had to follow. Brian looked directly at me. "What are you going to do?" The question sat heavily between us. For 63 years, I had always chosen forgiveness first. Protection, sacrifice, silence. Thomas's words returned. "Speaking the truth is not betrayal. Protecting yourself is not selfish." I took a deep breath. "I'm not selling the house." Brian nodded. He had expected that. "The trust stays exactly as Dad planned." Another nod. "And no one will make financial decisions for me." Jennifer quietly whispered, "Okay." Then I looked directly at my son. "But this doesn't end here." He swallowed. "What do you mean? You need help." He stared at me. "Financial help?" "No." His expression changed. "Professional help." The room became quiet. "You've been carrying this for years." His eyes filled. "I failed." "No." I shook my head. "You lied." The distinction mattered. Failure can happen to anyone. Dishonesty is a choice. Brian lowered his head. "I don't know how to fix it." For the first time all day, I heard genuine honesty. Not excuses, not pressure, not manipulation. Fear. Real fear. Emily spoke softly. "You start by telling the truth." He nodded. Jennifer reached for his hand. He allowed her to hold it. Perhaps for the first time in months, they were finally facing the same problem together. Outside, rain had begun falling. The sound reminded me of the night Thomas made me promise to protect myself. Perhaps he knew this day would come. Perhaps he understood that his family would one day sit around a table with broken trust between them. But he also understood something else. Truth, while painful, gives people a chance to rebuild. Lies only delay the collapse. As everyone slowly prepared to leave, Brian remained seated. He looked older, smaller, defeated. I walked toward him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "Are you ashamed of me?" My heart nearly broke. Because beneath all the debt, the lies, and the mistakes was still my son. I gently touched his shoulder. "I'm disappointed." He nodded. But no, his eyes filled with tears. "You are still my son." And for the first time that entire day, he finally allowed himself to cry without hiding. Because the truth had destroyed many things. But perhaps, if we were willing to face it, it had also saved what mattered most. The house felt unusually quiet after the family meeting. By the time everyone left, the rain had stopped and darkness had settled over the neighborhood. Emily stayed the night. Mason had gone home with his parents. Brian left without saying much, and Jennifer followed him with swollen eyes and trembling hands. I stood alone in my kitchen. For years, this room had witnessed birthdays, Christmas dinners, school projects, arguments, laughter, and grief. Now it had witnessed the truth. Emily gently touched my shoulder. "Mom, you should get some sleep." I nodded, but sleep never came. Instead, I sat in Thomas's chair and reread his letter. Again and again. Every sentence seemed different now. Every warning suddenly made sense. Most painful of all was the realization that Thomas had never stopped believing in me, even when I had stopped believing in myself. The next morning, Brian called. I stared at the phone. Emily looked at me. "You don't have to answer." But I did. His voice sounded weak. "Mom." "Yes." "Can I come over?" I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted more time. But another part understood that avoidance had already damaged our family enough. "Come." An hour later, Brian arrived alone. No Jennifer. No documents. No explanations prepared in advance. He looked terrible. His eyes were red. His clothes were wrinkled. For the first time in months, he looked less like a businessman and more like a frightened little boy. He stood in the kitchen awkwardly. "I don't know where to start." I pointed toward the table. "Sit." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked. Coffee cooled. Sunlight entered through the curtains. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry." The words seemed small. Too small for everything that had happened. But they were genuine. I looked at him. "What are you sorry for?" His eyes filled. "Everything." "Be specific." He lowered his head. "For lying." He swallowed. "For signing your name." Another pause. "For trying to take the house." Tears rolled down his face. "And for making you afraid of me." That sentence broke something inside me, because it was true. Not fear that he would hurt me physically, but fear that I no longer knew my own son. I quietly asked, "Why didn't you come to me?" He laughed bitterly. "Because Dad was right." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "I knew you'd save me." His honesty stunned me. He wiped his eyes. "I knew you'd sell the house if I cried enough." The words hurt, because I knew he was right, and so did he. I kept telling myself I'd fix everything later. His voice shook. But every month, the debt grew. I asked softly, "How bad is it?" He stared at the table. 340,000. My breath caught. "Brian." "I know." "How?" He leaned back. "The commercial property failed." "What property?" "A shopping center investment." He laughed quietly. "I thought I was going to become successful." His eyes became distant. "Everyone around me was making money. Everyone seemed ahead of me. I wanted more." I suddenly saw not the 40-year-old man sitting across from me. I saw the teenager who hated losing baseball games, The young man who always wanted to prove himself. The son who believed success determined worth. I disappointed Dad. My heart broke. No. He looked at me. Mom, I did. You disappointed yourself. Tears rolled down his cheeks. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, I asked the question that had haunted me. Did you ever intend to tell me the truth? He answered honestly. No. I nodded. Thank you. He looked surprised. Why? Because at least you're honest now. At noon, Jennifer arrived. She looked exhausted. She carried an overnight bag. Brian immediately stood. Jenny, she interrupted him. I stayed with my sister. The room became quiet. She looked at me. I'm sorry. I nodded. Then she turned toward her husband. You lied to me. Brian looked down. I was trying. No. She shook her head. You were hiding. Her voice trembled. You let me believe we were solving a problem together. Tears appeared. But you had already made decisions. For the first time, I realized Jennifer had also been trapped. Not innocent, but not fully informed. She sat down. I knew about the debt. She looked at me. But I didn't know about your signature. Brian closed his eyes. I know. And I didn't know how much we owed. Emily, who had quietly entered the kitchen, sat beside me. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Jennifer said something none of us expected. I think we should separate. Brian looked up. What? I can't do this anymore. His face became pale. Jennifer, I love you. Fresh tears fell. But I don't trust you. Those words seemed to destroy him. Because debt hurt, failure hurts. But losing trust is something deeper. Brian covered his face. Everything he had spent years trying to protect was collapsing anyway. His business, his finances, his marriage, his reputation, his relationship with me. Perhaps Thomas had understood something important. Sometimes the consequences we fear become inevitable the moment we begin lying. Emily finally spoke. What are you going to do now? Brian looked defeated. I don't know. Jennifer answered quietly. You tell the truth. The same words Emily had spoken the previous day. Truth. It had become the only path left. Later that afternoon, Brian and I sat alone on the back porch. The same porch where Thomas and I had spent countless evenings. Brian looked toward the backyard. Dad would be disappointed. I thought about that. Then I shook my head. No. He looked surprised. He'd be angry. Brian almost smiled. That sounds more like him. But disappointed. I looked at my son. No. He waited. Your father always believed people could recover. Brian's eyes filled again. Even me. Especially you. For the first time in days, some of the fear left his face. Not because his problems had disappeared, but because he understood something. I would not save him financially. I would not sacrifice my future. But I would not abandon him either. As evening approached, Brian stood to leave. He hesitated. Mom? Yes. He struggled to speak. Do you still love me? My eyes filled immediately. Because perhaps that was the real question behind everything. Not the house, not the money, not the debt. Love. I stood and embraced him. He cried against my shoulder exactly as he had when he was 8 years old and broke his arm. I love you, he nodded, but I have to face this myself. He whispered, I know. And for the first time since this nightmare began, my son finally understood that love and rescue are not the same thing. Sometimes, the most loving thing a mother can do is refuse to save her child from consequences, because only then can he learn to save himself. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The leaves in my backyard began turning gold and cool air slipped through the kitchen windows every morning. Nearly 4 months had passed since the family meeting, and for the first time in years, my home felt peaceful. Not because our problems had disappeared, because the lies had. Brian had started meeting with a financial counselor every week. He had sold his remaining investment shares, taken a second job consulting for a local construction company, and begun negotiating repayment plans with several creditors. Nothing happened quickly. Recovery never does. Jennifer had moved temporarily into her sister's home with Mason. They had not divorced, but they lived separately while trying to rebuild trust. Emily visited often. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we simply sat on the porch. For the first time since Thomas died, I no longer felt responsible for carrying everyone's pain. One October afternoon, Brian called. Mom. Yes. Would you meet me somewhere? My heart still tightened whenever his voice sounded serious. Where? The cemetery. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Okay. The following Sunday, I drove to the cemetery where Thomas had been buried almost 4 years earlier. The trees surrounding the grounds had turned orange and red. Brian was already there. He stood beside his father's headstone with his hands in his pockets. He looked older. Not physically. Life had simply caught up with him. As I walked toward him, he smiled weakly. Hi, Mom. Hi. For several moments, we stood in silence. Finally, Brian spoke. I've been coming here. I looked at him. Often. He nodded. Every week. The wind moved through the trees. I talked to Dad. I smiled slightly. So do I. He looked down. I apologize. Tears filled my eyes. Does it help? Sometimes. He laughed softly. I usually imagine what he'd say. I could almost hear Thomas myself. Probably something direct, something practical, something honest. Brian looked at the gravestone. I spent years trying to prove I was successful. He swallowed. And Dad already loved me. The truth of those words seemed to settle over both of us. Because many people spend their entire lives trying to earn love they already possess. I disappointed him. I gently shook my head. No. Brian looked surprised. I lied. Yes. I forged your signature. Yes. I nearly lost everything. Yes. His voice broke. So how didn't I disappoint him? I looked at Thomas's name carved into the stone, because suddenly I knew the answer. Because he expected you to stand back up. Brian began crying quietly. He saw this coming. He saw your fear. We remained there for nearly an hour. No arguments, no finances, no property. Only a mother and son standing beside the man who had loved both of them. As we prepared to leave, Brian said something I never expected. I'm filing bankruptcy. I looked at him. Are you sure? He nodded. My counselor thinks it's the only realistic option. He looked embarrassed. I feel like a failure. I took his hand. No. His eyes met mine. You failed. He looked confused. Those aren't the same things. For years, Brian had believed success defined his worth. Now he had to learn something Thomas had always understood. People are not their worst mistakes. A few weeks later, Jennifer asked if she could visit. She arrived alone. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea. She looked nervous. I owe you an apology. I smiled sadly. We both owe each other honesty. She nodded. I was angry at Brian. She looked down. But I was also angry at myself. Why? Because I wanted the house too. Her honesty surprised me. I convinced myself we deserved it. She wiped her eyes. I told myself we were helping you. I reached across the table. Fear makes people believe many things. She nodded. I don't know if our marriage will survive. I answered honestly. Neither do I. But I hope it does. She looked at me. Why? Because months earlier, I probably would have answered differently. Because I had learned something. People are not one moment, not one failure, not one terrible decision. I think people deserve the chance to change. Tears appeared in her eyes. Even us. Especially you. A week before Thanksgiving, Mason visited. He was taller, quieter, older somehow. We walked through the backyard together. He looked toward the old tree his grandfather had planted. Dad seems different. I smiled. He is. Mason kicked at the leaves. He talks to me more. That's good. He cries sometimes. I stopped walking. And what do you think about that? He shrugged. I think Grandpa would have cried too. I laughed softly. He certainly did. Mason looked at me. Are you staying here forever? I looked at the house, the windows, the porch, the memories, Thomas, my children, my entire life. I think so. He smiled. I'm glad. That evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room. The fire burned quietly. Thomas's letter rested beside me. I had read it dozens of times, yet one sentence still stayed with me. Protecting yourself is not selfish. For most of my life, I believed good mothers sacrificed everything. Good wives endured everything. Good women stayed silent. Thomas had spent his final days trying to teach me something different. Love does not require disappearing. Family does not require surrender. And silence does not heal people. The telephone rang. It was Brian. Mom? Yes. I just wanted to tell you something. What? His voice became emotional. I made my first payment today. I smiled. That's wonderful. It wasn't much. It doesn't have to be. He laughed softly. I think I'm finally growing up. Tears filled my eyes, because perhaps that was exactly what this entire painful journey had been about. Not money, not property, not inheritance. Growth, truth, responsibility, and the difficult kind of love that refuses to save someone from themselves. Before hanging up, Brian said something that stayed with me. Thank you for not giving me the house. I closed my eyes, because months earlier, those words would have sounded impossible. Now they sounded like healing. As I sat beside the fireplace that evening, the house no longer felt lonely. It felt earned. Thomas had protected me. Emily had stood beside me. Brian had finally begun facing himself. And for the first time in years, I realized something. My family had expected me to stay silent forever. But the moment I finally spoke, all of us began finding our way home. 1 year later, the house sounded different. Not quieter, not louder, simply different. The old clock still ticked above the fireplace. The porch still creaked when someone stepped onto it. The maple tree Thomas planted still cast its shadow across the backyard every evening. But the silence that had once filled these rooms had changed. It was no longer loneliness. It was peace. On a bright Saturday morning in early May, I stood in my kitchen, baking cinnamon rolls. The windows were open and birds sang somewhere beyond the garden. My 64th birthday was only a few days away. For the first time in many years, I was looking forward to it. The previous year had changed all of us. Emily had accepted a management position at the hospital in Cincinnati, but she drove to Columbus nearly every weekend. She no longer visited because she worried about me. She visited because we enjoyed each other's company. Our relationship had grown stronger. Sometimes we spent entire afternoons gardening. Sometimes we sat on the porch with coffee. Sometimes we simply talked about Thomas. And for the first time in years, I no longer felt guilty accepting her help. Brian's life had changed even more. The bankruptcy process had been painful. He sold several possessions. He downsized his own home. He worked 2 jobs. He attended financial counseling. Some days were good. Others were not. But he never asked me for money again. Not once. That mattered. Because the greatest change in my son was not financial. It was honesty. Several months after the family meeting, Brian began attending therapy. At first, he resisted. Later, he admitted it had saved him. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. I spent my entire life trying to prove I deserved Dad's respect. I looked at him. You already had it. He smiled sadly. I know that now. Jennifer eventually returned home. Their marriage survived, although not easily. Trust returned slowly, sometimes very slowly. But they began rebuilding together. No more secrets, no more hidden accounts, no more pretending. Even Mason changed. At 16, he had grown taller than both of his parents. He visited me often. Sometimes he mowed the lawn. Sometimes he helped me plant flowers. Sometimes we simply sat in the garage while he talked about school friends and his future. One afternoon he asked me, "Grandma, why didn't you tell everyone the truth sooner?" I thought about that question for a long time because the answer was complicated. I thought silence protected people. He nodded. Did it? I smiled sadly. No. He kicked at a stone. Dad says you saved him. I looked at him. No. He frowned. You didn't? I shook my head. Your father saved himself. The truth seemed to surprise him, but it was important, because people only change when they choose to, not when others rescue them. On my birthday, everyone came to the house, the same dining room, the same table where our family had nearly fallen apart. But this time, things felt different. No folders, no documents, no pressure, only family. Emily brought flowers. Jennifer baked a pie. Mason hung decorations. Even Brian looked relaxed. After dinner, he stood. The room immediately became quiet. I saw several people exchange nervous smiles. Brian laughed. Don't worry. Everyone relaxed. He looked at me. I need to say something. His voice trembled slightly. A year ago, I thought losing money was the worst thing that could happen to me. He paused. I was wrong. The room remained silent. The worst thing was almost losing my family. He looked directly at me. I asked Mom to sacrifice her future because I was afraid to face my own mistakes. Tears filled my eyes. He continued. She said no. He smiled. And it was the best thing she ever did for me. The room was completely quiet. Brian walked toward me. He handed me a small box. I opened it carefully. Inside sat Thomas's old pocket watch. My husband had carried it for nearly 30 years. I looked up. Brian's eyes were wet. I found it while cleaning. I gently touched the watch. He would want you to have it. Tears rolled down my face because suddenly Thomas felt close again. Not in grief, not in loss, but in love. After everyone left that evening, I sat alone on the back porch. The stars filled the sky. The old pocket watch rested in my hand. Thomas's letter sat beside me. I had read it many times during the past year, but I no longer needed it for strength. Because somehow, through all the pain, I had finally found my own. I thought about the woman I had been, the woman who apologized to keep peace, the woman who remained silent, the woman who believed her value came from sacrifice. She was gone. Not because I became stronger, because I finally allowed myself to matter. Thomas had protected me. Emily had supported me. Brian had changed. But the most important thing I learned was something much simpler. Speaking the truth does not destroy families. Secrets do. Silence does. Fear does. The truth gives people a chance. As the night grew darker, my telephone rang. It was Brian. Mom. Yes. I forgot to tell you something. What? His voice softened. Thank you. For what? For not staying silent. I closed my eyes. Tears came again. But they were different now. Peaceful. Healing. I love you, Brian. I love you too. After we hung up, I looked at Thomas's watch one final time. For years, my family expected me to stay quiet. They expected me to surrender. They expected me to continue sacrificing myself. They were wrong. Because the day I finally found my voice was not the day my family fell apart. It was the day we finally began telling each other the truth. And sometimes, the most loving words a person can say are simply these, no, enough. And finally, I matter too. C-T-A. Sometimes the hardest lesson we learn in life is that love and sacrifice are not the same thing. Many women spend their entire lives taking care of everyone else. We become wives, mothers, grandmothers, caregivers, and peacemakers. We stay quiet to avoid arguments. We forgive quickly to keep the family together. We give away our time, our dreams, our comfort, and sometimes even our own voices, because we believe that is what love requires. But real love should never demand that we disappear. Elise's story reminds us that silence does not always protect a family. Sometimes silence allows fear, resentment, and dishonesty to grow in the dark. The truth may hurt, but it also gives people a chance to heal. Lies only postpone the pain. Another powerful lesson is that our children do not need us to rescue them from every consequence. They need our love, our guidance, and our support, but they also need the opportunity to stand up after they fall. Protecting someone from every mistake can sometimes prevent them from becoming stronger. Growing older does not make our dreams less important. It does not make our feelings less valuable. Our homes, our memories, and our voices still matter. We are not burdens. We are not invisible. We do not lose the right to make our own decisions simply because we age. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this saying, no to someone you love does not mean you love them less. Sometimes no is the most loving word we can say. Sometimes protecting ourselves is the very thing that allows a family to finally become honest. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever stayed silent to keep peace in your family? Have you ever had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting someone you love? I'd truly love to hear your story. Please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if this journey moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and joining us again for more stories about family healing, courage, and finding the strength to use your voice. No matter your age, your voice still matters. And it is never too late to speak your truth.